October 24, 1944. A single American submarine surfaces in the darkness of the Formosa Strait. In the next 19 minutes, you're going to discover how one vessel destroyed more enemy tonnage than an entire nation's navy, the fatal mistake that ended its legendary career, and the underwater battle tactic that changed naval warfare forever. But first, imagine being trapped 180 feet underwater while your own torpedo circles back toward you. The USS Tang wasn't the biggest submarine. It wasn't the fastest, but by the fall of 1944, this 311-foot Balao-class submarine had become something the Imperial Japanese Navy feared more than anything else prowling the Pacific. Under the command of a 38-year-old officer named Richard O'Kane, the Tang had sunk more enemy ships in less time than anyone thought possible, while the entire Italian Navy managed to sink roughly 72,000 tons of Allied shipping during World War II. This single American submarine had already surpassed that number. And O'Kane wasn't done yet. Here's what makes this story impossible to believe. The Tang accomplished this in just 5 war patrols, 5 missions. Most submarines were considered successful if they sank a handful of ships during their entire service. O'Kane's crew was sinking multiple vessels per patrol, using tactics so aggressive that other submarine commanders thought he was either brilliant or insane. Probably both. The Japanese had a name for the submarine that kept appearing in their shipping lanes, destroying convoy after convoy. They called it the Ghost, because it would strike without warning, devastate their forces, and vanish before their escorts could respond. But October 24th would be different. The Tang had already sunk 2 cargo ships earlier that night, bringing its total to 24 enemy vessels. O'Kane spotted another convoy, 7 ships protected by multiple destroyers. Standard protocol said to withdraw. You don't attack a heavily defended convoy when you've already had a successful night. But O'Kane saw an opportunity. He positioned the Tang for a surface attack in complete darkness, using a tactic that would either cement his legend or end his career in the next 60 seconds. What happened next would become the most tragic success story in submarine warfare history. A single malfunction, a split-second decision, and the most decorated submarine in U.S. Navy history would face its final battle. But to understand how it all went wrong, you need to know what made O'Kane and his crew so dangerously effective. The answer lies in a training mission 2 years earlier, where O'Kane learned a lesson that would save hundreds of American lives and cost thousands of Japanese sailors theirs. 1942, Pearl Harbor. Richard O'Kane stood on the deck of the USS Wahoo as its executive officer, watching his commanding officer, Dudley "Mush" Morton, break every rule in the submarine warfare manual. Traditional doctrine said submarines should attack from deep, fire torpedoes from maximum range, and immediately dive to escape. Morton did the opposite. He brought the Wahoo to periscope depth, closed to point-blank range, and stayed up to watch his torpedoes hit. The Navy brass called it reckless. O'Kane called it the future. During their 3rd patrol together, Morton and O'Kane perfected what they called down-the-throat shots. When a destroyer charged at them, instead of diving and running, they'd aim straight at the bow of the attacking ship and fire. It required ice-cold nerves. The destroyer would be racing toward them at 30 knots, depth charges ready, and O'Kane would be calmly calculating angles through the periscope. Fire too early, the destroyer turns. Fire too late, you're dead. But fire at exactly the right moment, and the destroyer's own momentum carries it into your torpedo. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. Their anti-submarine tactics became useless against a commander who attacked when he should have been defending. By 1943, O'Kane had absorbed everything Morton taught him. When he received command of the brand-new USS Tang in October of that year, he had a reputation and a mission. The Tang's first patrol in January 1944 set the tone. 5 ships sunk in one patrol. The second patrol, 7 ships. O'Kane was hunting with a precision that terrified the Japanese merchant marine. He studied their convoy patterns, learned their escort tactics, and exploited every weakness. He discovered that Japanese destroyers would often abandon damaged ships to chase submarines. So he'd damage a ship, let the escorts chase him, then circle back to finish off the wounded vessel. Wait, it gets better. O'Kane developed a surface attack strategy that seemed suicidal but was actually genius. He'd approach convoys at night, staying on the surface where the Tang could move faster and maneuver better. The submarine's low profile made it nearly invisible in darkness. By the time Japanese lookouts spotted them, O'Kane's crew had already fired. And here's the detail nobody talks about. The Tang's fire control system was operated by the same crew for every patrol. They knew each other's timing perfectly. O'Kane could call out target data, and his team would have a firing solution in under 30 seconds. In submarine warfare, that speed was the difference between sinking ships and becoming a target. But there was a cost to this aggressive hunting. The Tang's crew lived in constant tension. They spent weeks at sea breathing recycled air, eating canned food, knowing that every attack brought them closer to a mistake that could kill them all. O'Kane pushed them harder than any other submarine commander. Some crew members requested transfers. Others became the most elite submarine sailors in the Pacific Fleet. By the Tang's 5th patrol in September 1944, they were a weapon unlike anything the Japanese had encountered. They'd perfected the art of the night surface attack. They could fire all 6 forward torpedo tubes, reload and fire again in under 8 minutes. And they were about to embark on a patrol that would either make them immortal or destroy them completely. September 24, 1944. The Tang departed Pearl Harbor for its 5th war patrol with 24 Mark 18 electric torpedoes and a crew that had become legendary. Their assigned patrol area was the Formosa Strait, one of the most dangerous hunting grounds in the Pacific. The Japanese were desperate. American submarines had already devastated their merchant fleet, and every ship that didn't make it to Japan meant less fuel, less ammunition, less food for their military. They were running convoys with heavier escorts, multiple destroyers, and air cover when possible. O'Kane read the intelligence reports and smiled. More escorts meant bigger, more valuable convoys. The first week was quiet. Too quiet. O'Kane prowled the strait, surfacing at night to charge batteries and scan the horizon. His radar operator, a 22-year-old from Ohio, spent hours staring at the green screen, looking for the distinctive blips that meant targets. On October 10th, they got their first contact. A small convoy, 3 cargo ships with 2 escorts. O'Kane studied the formation through his periscope. The escorts were staying close, probably nervous after losing so many ships in these waters. He made a decision that would have gotten most commanders court-martialed. He decided to attack in broad daylight, submerged from less than 1,000 yards. The Tang crept forward at 3 knots, silent as death. O'Kane watched through the periscope, calling out ranges and bearings. His fire control team fed the data into their analog computer, calculating the intercept point. At 800 yards, O'Kane gave the order. 6 torpedoes launched in sequence, each aimed at a different target. The crew counted seconds. 45, 50, 55. Boom. The first torpedo struck a cargo ship amidships, breaking its back. Before the escorts could react, 2 more explosions. 2 ships sinking, 1 damaged. The destroyers charged toward the Tang's position, but O'Kane had already gone deep, using a thermal layer to hide his submarine's acoustic signature. By the time the depth charges started falling, the Tang was a mile away. Over the next 2 weeks, O'Kane and his crew went on a rampage. They sank a troop transport carrying 4,000 Japanese soldiers. They destroyed a tanker loaded with aviation fuel, creating a fire visible for 20 miles. They torpedoed a destroyer that got too close, using one of Morton's down-the-throat shots. The Japanese command in Formosa was in chaos. They didn't know if they were facing one submarine or an entire wolf pack. Radio intercepts showed increasing panic in Japanese communications. Some convoys were refusing to sail. Others were taking longer, more dangerous routes to avoid the area where the Tang was hunting. And here's where you need to pay attention, because this is what made O'Kane different from every other submarine commander. He wasn't just sinking ships. He was studying Japanese psychology. After each attack, he'd stay in the area, submerged, listening to the rescue efforts. He learned that Japanese escorts would spend hours searching for survivors, making them vulnerable to follow-up attacks. He discovered that damaged ships would often try to make it to the nearest port rather than accept help, sailing alone and undefended. He exploited every pattern, every habit, every assumption the Japanese made. By October 23rd, the Tang had sunk 22 enemy vessels. O'Kane needed 2 more to break the all-time record for a single submarine, and he knew exactly where to find them. October 23rd, evening. The Tang's radar picked up a massive convoy heading south through the Formosa Strait. O'Kane studied the contact reports. 10 cargo ships, at least 4 destroyer escorts, possibly more. This wasn't just a convoy. This was a lifeline. The Japanese were moving critical supplies to their forces in the Philippines, where American forces were preparing for invasion. If this convoy made it through, thousands of American soldiers would face a better-equipped enemy. O'Kane called his officers to the control room. They had 8 torpedoes left, against 14 ships. The math didn't work, unless they got creative. O'Kane's plan was insane. He would attack on the surface at night from inside the convoy formation. The Tang would race ahead of the convoy, position itself among the cargo ships, and fire at point-blank range before the escorts realized what was happening. It violated every safety protocol. If the Japanese spotted them, the Tang would be surrounded, taking fire from multiple directions with nowhere to run. His executive officer quietly suggested they shadow the convoy and call in other submarines. O'Kane shook his head. By the time help arrived, the convoy would be gone. They were doing this alone, tonight. At 2 a.m. on October 24th, the Tang surfaced and began its approach. The night was dark, no moon, perfect conditions. O'Kane stood on the bridge with his lookouts, watching the silhouettes of cargo ships materialize out of the darkness. The convoy was sailing in 3 columns, destroyers on the flanks. O'Kane aimed for the gap between the center and starboard columns. At 20 knots, the Tang sliced through the water, spray flying, diesel engines roaring. They were committed now. No turning back. At 2:30 a.m., O'Kane gave the order to fire. The forward torpedo tubes released their deadly cargo, 6 electric torpedoes racing toward targets less than 500 yards away. The crew didn't wait to see the results. They were already reloading, moving with practiced efficiency. 30 seconds later, the first explosion lit up the night. Then another, and another. 3 ships hit, 2 sinking immediately. Chaos erupted. The cargo ships broke formation, trying to scatter. The destroyer's searchlights swept the water looking for the attacker, but the Tang was already moving, positioning for another shot. Now here's where it gets absolutely crazy, and if you're not already hooked on this story, hit that like button, because what happens next is why this submarine became legendary. O'Kane spotted a destroyer racing toward them, searchlight blazing. Instead of diving, he turned the Tang toward it. His crew thought he'd lost his mind. The destroyer was 800 yards away and closing fast. O'Kane calmly called out firing data. At 400 yards, he fired the Tang's last 2 forward torpedoes. The destroyer's captain saw the torpedo wakes and tried to turn. Too late. Both torpedoes struck the destroyer's bow, and it exploded in a fireball that illuminated the entire convoy. The Tang had just destroyed its 24th victim, tying the all-time record, and they still had 2 torpedoes left in the stern tubes. 2:52 a.m. The Tang turned to line up a shot with its stern tubes. O'Kane had spotted 2 cargo ships trying to escape together, sailing close to each other for mutual protection. It wouldn't save them. The Tang maneuvered into position, and O'Kane prepared to fire the last 2 torpedoes. His crew was exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee. They'd been at battle stations for over an hour, attacking one of the most heavily defended convoys in the Pacific. 2 more ships, and they could go deep, escape, and head home as the most successful submarine patrol in history. At 2:55 a.m., O'Kane fired the first stern torpedo. Perfect shot. The torpedo ran straight and true, striking the lead cargo ship below the waterline. The ship began listing immediately. 1 more. O'Kane repositioned slightly, accounting for the Tang's movement and the target's speed. At 2:57 a.m., he fired the final torpedo. The crew heard it launch, felt the slight shudder as the weapon left the tube. They waited for the explosion. 60 seconds, nothing. 70 seconds, still nothing. O'Kane raised his binoculars, scanning the darkness. Where was the impact? Then someone shouted from the bridge. The torpedo was porpoising, running erratically on the surface, and it was turning. The Mark 18 torpedo had a known defect. Sometimes, rarely, the gyroscope would malfunction and the torpedo would circle back. It had happened to other submarines, but never at this range, never during a surface attack. O'Kane watched in horror as the torpedo completed its turn and began heading straight back toward the Tang. They had maybe 20 seconds. O'Kane screamed. Orders. All ahead flank. Hard right rudder. The Tang's engines roared to full power and the submarine began to turn. But submarines don't turn quickly, especially not from a standing start. The torpedo was traveling at 46 knots. The Tang could barely manage 20. O'Kane's crew braced for impact. Some men prayed, others just held on. The torpedo closed the distance in seconds. O'Kane saw it clearly now, a white wake racing toward his submarine stern. He had time for one thought. After everything, after 24 ships, after becoming legends, they were about to be killed by their own weapon. At 2:58 a.m., the torpedo struck the Tang's aft torpedo room. The explosion was catastrophic. The stern section crumpled like paper. Water flooded in at tremendous pressure. The Tang's stern sank immediately, and the bow pointed toward the sky. Men were thrown across compartments. The lights went out. Emergency systems failed. O'Kane and 8 men on the bridge were thrown into the water by the force of the explosion. Below decks, 78 crew members fought for their lives as the Tang plunged toward the bottom, 180 feet below. The most successful submarine in U.S. Navy history was sinking, and the Japanese destroyers were coming. The Tang hit the bottom at 3:02 a.m. Inside the flooded compartments, 78 men faced an impossible decision. The forward torpedo room was intact but filling with water. The control room was damaged but still had air. They were trapped at 180 feet with limited oxygen, rising water, and no way to signal for help. Above them, Japanese destroyers circled, dropping depth charges on what they thought was a dying submarine. Each explosion shook the hull, loosening more seams, letting in more water. The crew had maybe 2 hours of breathable air, less if they panicked. Lieutenant Commander O'Kane floated in the oil-slicked water, watching his submarine die. Of the 9 men thrown from the bridge, only 5 survived the initial explosion. They clung to debris as Japanese searchlights swept the water. A destroyer approached, and O'Kane realized they were about to be either rescued or machine-gunned. The Japanese sailors pulled them from the water. O'Kane expected execution. Instead, they were beaten, interrogated, and locked in the destroyer's hold. The Japanese wanted to know how many American submarines were operating in the area. O'Kane said, "Nothing." He'd already seen the Tang's bow slip beneath the waves. As far as he knew, his entire crew was dead. But inside the sunken submarine, something extraordinary was happening. The survivors organized themselves. They had 5 Mumsen lungs, primitive escape devices that provided a small amount of oxygen during ascent. 13 men volunteered to try. The plan was simple and terrifying. They would flood the forward torpedo room completely, equalizing pressure with the ocean outside. Then they'd open the escape hatch and swim 180 feet to the surface in complete darkness, hoping the Japanese wouldn't shoot them when they arrived. The first group of 4 men entered the torpedo room. They closed the hatch behind them, opened the flood valves, and waited as cold seawater rose around them. At 4:30 a.m., the first man popped to the surface, gasping for air. Then another, and another. 8 men successfully escaped the Tang before the remaining air became too contaminated. They surfaced among burning ships and debris from the convoy they'd destroyed. Japanese sailors pulled them from the water, and they joined O'Kane in captivity. 68 men died with the Tang, but 13 survived, including the most successful submarine commander in American history. The Japanese couldn't believe it. The submarine that had terrorized their shipping lanes for months had been sunk by its own torpedo. They thought it was propaganda, until O'Kane confirmed it. The USS Tang's final tally: 33 ships sunk, over 116,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed. More than the entire Italian Navy sank during the entire war. O'Kane spent the rest of the war in a Japanese POW camp, where he was tortured and starved. He never broke, never gave up information, never stopped being a submarine commander. When American forces liberated the camp in August 1945, O'Kane weighed 88 pounds. He'd survived 10 months of hell with the same ice-cold determination that made him legendary. In 1946, President Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor. His citation mentioned his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity and his indomitable determination. But here's what they don't tell you in history books. After the war, O'Kane visited the families of every man who died on the Tang, all 68 of them. He told them their sons, husbands, and brothers were heroes, that they'd saved thousands of American lives by destroying ships that would have supplied enemy forces. That their sacrifice mattered. Some families forgave him for surviving when their loved ones didn't. Others never could. O'Kane carried that weight for the rest of his life. He died in 1994 at age 83, still the most decorated submarine commander in U.S. naval history. The Tang's legacy lived on in the submarines named after it, in the tactics O'Kane pioneered, and in the impossible standard of courage and skill he set. 1 submarine, 93 men, 5 patrols. A record that will likely never be broken, because modern warfare doesn't produce legends like the USS Tang. It produces statistics, and some stories are too extraordinary to be reduced to numbers. This was one of them.